Persona 5 is technically the perfect video game. Not just the perfect JRPG, but the perfect game. Apologies in advance, I'm not streaming Persona 5 because, well, Atlus doesn't really let you record their games. They block everything. So, unfortunately, getting footage of that would be difficult for me. So instead, we're just streaming the next best thing, Guilty Gear, which is still anime as fuck, and pretty. It's become kind of my go-to stream game, so, you know. Again, apologies. May not exactly be on point, but that is not the point, viewers. The point is, Persona 5 is really, really dope. The more I think back on it, the more I think about how well-rounded it is, and a lot of the other JRPGs I've played over the years. I once said it was the best JRPG since Chrono Trigger. But now I'm going to go a step further and say it's the best JRPG ever made. And by extension, a prime example of what the perfect video game should be. And I think what that ultimately amounts to is a perfect balance of both agency and structure. Now this is something that a lot of developers, I think, take for granted. There are many, many video games I've played over the years that are either too structured and rigid, or far too open-ended and, well, give you too much agency. When really, I think for a game to be perfectly balanced, it has to have a perfect combination of the two, without sacrificing the other. So, Persona 5, for me, is that example. It is an example of a game that has just enough structure, but also a balance of possibility and agency. And this is done in a variety of ways through its mechanics. A lot of people often criticize JRPGs in particular for being too linear and too rigid in structure, and giving the player too little agency in the story. And to be fair, this is a valid complaint. Some of them, or I would say the lesser JRPGs out there, do have this problem. It is more noticeable. For example, I loved Dragon Quest XI, don't get me wrong, it was a good game. It was a good, solid RPG, but, well, if you're not a fan of JRPGs, that one's certainly not going to change your mind, because it has a lot of structure and very little agency for the player. I mean, you're doing the usual thing, going from town to town, quest to quest, in the main storyline. There might be some side activities here and there, but for the most part, you're really just following the plot and upgrading your weapons and gear whenever you have the chance to do so. So there's really not much room for the player to express choice. Now, this doesn't mean that the game doesn't have some merit. Doesn't mean there aren't qualities that might carry a player like me, who just loves JRPGs, through the experience. But I can't deny that compared to something like Persona 5, it's incredibly lacking when it comes to freedom of gameplay and choice. So Persona 5 is the perfect RPG, in my mind. Let's compare for a second Persona 5 to another JRPG that I actually don't like at all, Final Fantasy 13. Now, a lot of people in the eastern side of the world claim that this was the result of a linear narrative. The players were complaining about the fact that it was just a story-driven RPG. But really, Final Fantasy XIII's problems were a bit deeper than that. It was too linear of a game. You're basically just going down multiple hallways and rigidly structured environments, fighting enemy group after enemy group, and just, well, upgrading your gear and equipment whenever you get the chance to do so. That's it, that's the game. There's very little exploration in 13, and please don't bring up the part where you get to Cocoon or Grand Pulse or whatever it's called, because that does not help the game in any way. It comes far too late in the experience and grinds the story to a halt. So for me, no, the game does not get better after 40 hours. I'm sorry. I think Final Fantasy XIII remains a problematic game all the way through. It does not improve. And this is a problem Persona 5 does not have. There is agency in Persona 5. Yeah, you don't really affect the main plot overall very much, but this is, again, perfectly balanced by what you can affect. For one thing, the social links between the dungeons are a great way for the player to decide how they're going to build their Persona team, how they're going to affect their stats in battle, because as we know, the social links you form will affect how you play the game's combat. It'll also affect what kind of persona you get strengthened up. And let's not forget that you have the freedom and agency to build and collect your own team of persona. And on top of this, you get to decide when to fuse them, which kind to fuse. Sometimes later in the game, you can fuse 3 of them to form stronger persona. And these are all tough decisions to make, because they affect how the rest of the game plays out. Maybe not the main plot. The main plot is still a nice scripted linear thing for the most part. But this is actually a good thing. The stuff that you can affect is on the margins. It's in the periphery, but it is definitely a part of the game's plot. Only you get to decide, for example, who Joker ends up with at the end of the game. And this is going to be different for every player. And not only that, you have to work to form those relationships. You have to make the right decisions, the right choices, and communicate with them in the right way to get them to end up with you at the end of the game. So, yeah, you get to choose your friends, you get to choose your personas outside of the main stuff. So the game still retains structure, but also lets you go off and, well, make your own decisions along the way. And the fact that you are making decisions, whether in a dungeon and fighting monsters and gaining new persona, but also while you're out there forming relationships with other classmates and other characters in general. And better yet, fucking cherry on the frickin' sundae here, is that all of those decisions affect one another. It all comes together. It all forms a single loop. Everything you do matters and affects the rest of the game. So nothing is done in isolation, and nothing is done for its own sake. That's a lot of intertwined mechanics going on, and a lot of agency and decision making in a linear JRPG. And to me, this is how you do it. This is how you get, not just in JRPGs, but in video games in general, how you form the perfect harmony, the perfect balance between player agency and structure. You gotta have a little of both. Because if you don't, and better yet, if they don't interconnect, then what you end up with is a game that's a little anemic. Maybe it still has some core appeal for you, but that appeal isn't going to take away the feeling of lack. It's not going to take away the fact that you lack agency, or in a game that's too open-ended, lack structure and guidance. Persona 5 has both. It has a healthy degree of both. Take the Mementos Dungeon, for example. Much like everything else in the game's player agency-free decision-making, Mementos is a dungeon you can access that's randomly generated and full of multiple floors, with loads and loads of personas and secret treasures to find. And better yet, it exists outside of the main plot, which means it's a chance for the player to experience all of the game's mechanics when it comes to combat and personas and social links in a very open-ended way that isn't linear or structured. So you get your cake and you get to eat it too. This is what Persona 5 does so well. In addition to being a gorgeous, awesome sounding, perfectly tuned and polished experience that spans over 120 hours with very minimal filler. That's a fucking video game. That's an experience right there. And I never felt while playing it that I was lacking agency or lacking a sense of structure. There's always just enough of both. And the two are not separate from each other. Both are always present. The stats you get from the social links you made will still show up even if you're fighting a structured, linear boss encounter. All of that pays off. It all feeds into each other in an endless loop until you finish the game. And when you do reach the end of Persona 5, you feel like it was an ending you formed for yourself. At least, partly. And that is the payoff right there. Compare this to Final Fantasy XIII, where you're just following an endless string of linear battles and making almost no decisions for yourself. Yeah, I know it's got that Sphery upgrade thing, but I mean, come on. You're not making many decisions while playing Final Fantasy XIII. There's very little player agency. I personally didn't like it. That's not to say somebody couldn't get enjoyment out of it. I mean, it had good music, had good graphics. The combat was fine. So, I mean, there's a game there, but it just feels one-sided to me. And that's what separates it from something as grand and masterful as Persona 5. Now, in addition to this, I want to mention another game that I think had too much structure and too little agency. And this one might be a bit more controversial. Okami. Now, I love Okami's visuals, I love its Shinto lore, its folklore-y stuff. All that's on point and really charming. It's got a good story. But the gameplay is literally just connect the dots. You are just connecting the dots in that game from start to finish. Very little player agency. The combat, I felt, was incredibly redundant and repetitive. And there's very little to almost no exploration. Not a bad game by any means, but the lack of agency is felt. And it's only the story and the visuals that mostly carry the game. So there you go. Again, you gotta have that agency. And of course, there are also games that go too far in the opposite direction. I think a good example of this would be Metal Gear Solid 5. Very open-ended, very free-roaming, and you do have a ton of agency in how you build your army and how you gain new gear and equipment from the base. All that's fine, but the story completely falls apart after like the first quarter of the overall experience. It's an unfinished game with a lot of missing story beats, and in general, the overall narrative structure is severely lacking. And once you get to a certain point in the game, a lot of its intertwining mechanics become kind of, well, for their own sake, really. Now, you still get a pretty open-ended, badass stealth action game. I think as an open-ended stealth action game, Phantom Pain is great. But it is lacking. It's lacking structure. That's the problem I have with Phantom Pain. Too little narrative thrust after the initial hours. And this is not a problem Persona 5 has. It's the better 5, is what I'm trying to say. Better 5 with the better shit. So yeah, it's the perfect video game. Seriously. The only other RPG that I could compare it to would be past Persona games, really. Those also had a nice balance. Pretty much the same balance as Persona 5, but not nearly as impressive on a technical level, or the fact that every story dungeon is totally unique. But I still praise those games almost as highly for having that balance. I mean, as much as I love the Final Fantasy series, even the best ones had a little bit too much linearity at times. I'm not saying that's the case with the best ones. I mean, well, I did just say that, didn't I? Even the good ones. I mean, the good ones Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VI, I don't know. You had decisions to make in those games. What kind of material you were equipping, who you get to ride on the Ferris wheel with. There's the little things like that that do make a difference. And Chrono Trigger, hell, the Final Fantasy, not Final Fantasy, the game, the RPG that before Persona 5 came along, I thought was the best, bar none. Even in that game, there are little things you can do that affect the overall gameplay experience. And to some degree, the narrative experience. That game has a lot of multiple endings. The combat, the way you set it up, depending on who you have in your party, can affect how the combat plays out, since you have group attacks during party gameplay. That's the kind of stuff that goes a very long way. But again, outside of Persona series, I just don't know any JRPGs, other than like maybe tactical strategy RPGs and stuff like that, that give you that much agency and that much choice, while still retaining a tight narrative structure. Because there are a lot of people out there that would argue Western RPGs are better because they're more open-ended and do give you more agency. But I call bullshit on that, because those games tend to lack structure. Severely lacking in structure. It's why I don't like the Elder Scrolls games very much, because they're a little too open-ended. And it feels like you're missing that, like, I don't know, that narrative thrust and momentum, you know? Everything feels a little too disconnected. And again, obviously it's a popular series, people do love it, and I think it's because they prefer that open-endedness. They're willing to sacrifice the structure for that freedom. That's fine, we all have our preferences. But for me, I like balance. I like the harmony between the two. And that's what Atlus has achieved with Persona 5. Or hell, even another Atlus game, their spin-off, Catherine. A lot of freedom there, lots of player agency there. Given the very sporadic, very sort of improvisational puzzle gameplay you gotta deal with. Even the gameplay itself is pretty open-ended. But you also get to decide which girl you're gonna end up with at the end of the game. Especially Catherine Full Body, where you get the third one. Player agency, choice. When you're at the bar, when you're at the Stray Sheep, you can decide who to talk to, who to interact with, in what order, how much to drink. Again, these seem like trivial things on paper, but in execution, you really do feel like you're kind of guiding this character in your own unique way that might be totally different from other players out there, while still having a polished narrative, while still having a sense of narrative thrust and structure that feels tight and polished. That is balance right there. That is harmony. You still get your cutscenes, you still get your strong characters and all that, but there is agency, there are multiple outcomes, there is a sense that you're affecting the way the game plays out that's gonna be unique to your own experience with it. And that's always been my thing. That's always been what I look for in video games. What I see as like perfection is having that duplicity there. You know? Give me a story that is linear, give me a story that is well written, tightly structured, but give me that free roam, give me that agency to make my playthrough unique from somebody else's. Because otherwise, if it's something like Final Fantasy 13 or Okami, it's going to be mostly the same experience for every single player. And I'm just not a fan of that. It's just not... It's not as fun of an experience for me. I feel like something is missing, you know? Now, the same may not be true for games that are more open-ended but lack structure. But then I just feel like I'm losing a sense of motivation to play. You know? The narrative thrust kind of acts like the spine of a game. You know, it's what frames it, holds it together. And if things are too open-ended, I might feel less motivation to keep playing. So yeah, for me, that's what makes Persona 5 so freaking dope. Easily one of the best games of the 2010s. And another game that I consider a favorite of that generation, Nier Automata, has those same qualities. So, I mean, I put that one pretty high as well. But Persona 5 is like, it is perfection. It to me is like, this is how you make the perfect video game. So, if you guys agree, disagree, let me know in the comments. Hit that like and subscribe if you like what I'm doing here, or like to support the channel. And until next time, viewers, live for the passion.